Hi everyone, and welcome to the recorded lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 2. I am Dr. Patricia Riley and I'll be your instructor for this course. In the first lecture done online, we will cover continue on with the endocrine system, but focus in on endocrine glands. And you can see on this image some of the main endocrine glands that we will be covering in this lecture. We will not be covering the testes and the ovaries, as those will be covered in the reproductive lecture later on. And we will also not be covering the thymus gland. There are many other minor hormones that are released from other parts of our body that aren't considered your traditional endocrine glands. So please keep in mind as we go through this lecture that the endocrine gland system is much more comprehensive than what we will be covering in this lecture. Now let's begin with the most, probably the most important and diverse endocrine gland within the body, located within the brain, and that's the pituitary gland, which you can see here. If we focus in here, we can view a cross-section through the medial plane, through the center of the brain. You can see the thalamus, and underneath that you can see the hypothalamus, so hypo being below the thalamus, and then of course you can see the pituitary gland here. Connected to the hypothalamus is the pituitary, as I just said, and the pituitary gland is really two distinct glands that have two different ways of releasing hormones. You can see if we zoom in here, you can see further detail at the bottom of the screen. And I'd like you to pay attention to the stalk that connects these two together, so connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And this is where there are neurons and blood vessels that allow for the connection between these two areas of the brain. And we call this the infundibulum. The two separate glands are called the adenohypophysis. So we're looking at this region here, the anterior part of the brain. It's also referred to, or the anterior part of the pituitary gland, also called the anterior pituitary gland, anterior being more forward or toward the front. And the other part of the pituitary gland is the neurohypophysis. As you can see, it's not, I don't think it's printed on this slide, but it is, the pituitary is also called the hypophysis. And so just to repeat, the posterior part of the pituitary gland, or the posterior pituitary, is also called the neurohypophysis. I would like to bring your attention now to the hypothalamus, which we'll speak about in more detail later. And again, that's this area here, and it's really the principal integrator within our body of both the endocrine systems and the autonomic nervous systems. This would have been discussed in AMP1. And this structure plays a very important role in coordinating and making sure that the effects of the autonomic nervous system hormones and the endocrine system hormones are in sync and not conflicting with each other and trying to do opposite things. Remember, we spoke about in class that the endocrine system and the nervous system play an important role on their own, but also together. This is a diagram from your textbook which overviews the 7 main hormones that are released from the pituitary gland. We'll begin by focusing in on the adenohypophysis, also known as the anterior pituitary, and the 5 hormones that are released here. And of these hormones, we have growth hormone, we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, so growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, we have thyroid stimulating hormone, gonadotropic hormones, which include follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and then finally prolactin. You will oftentimes see the short form written in readings. Oftentimes growth hormone is used interchangeably with GH, but you should definitely know what it stands for. So being aware of those abbreviations. So let's begin in this area here, beginning with the adenohypophysis, and then we'll carry on into the neurohypophysis afterwards. If we look into the anterior pituitary, we would discover that there are 5 functional types of secretory cells. So these are the cells that are going to be present within this area of the gland, and they're responsible for secreting a different type of hormone. So you're going to have different types of cells within the gland that are responsible for secreting specific hormones, producing and secreting specific hormones. And you can see that here on the screen. And you should be aware that the different cells are both functionally and anatomically distinct. So cells that secrete growth hormone are referred to as somatotrophs. Growth hormone is sometimes referred to as somatotropin hormone because of the cells that produce it. Okay, so growth hormone is sometimes referred to as somatotropin hormone. Cells that secrete prolactin are called lactotrophs. Cells that secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone are called corticotrophs. Cells that secrete thyroid stimulating hormone are called thyrotrophs. And finally, cells that secrete luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are called gonadotrophs. You can see a commonality amongst many of the cell names and their corresponding releasing hormone. So next up, we'll discuss both growth hormone and prolactin after that, and then we'll continue on with the remaining hormones on this slide. Okay, so we're beginning with growth hormone and prolactin. As I've already mentioned, growth hormone is also known as somatotropin hormone. Growth hormone, as the name suggests, promotes growth of many tissues, but primarily acts on bone and muscle. This hormone does many things as part of promoting this growth of bone and muscle, including accelerating the rate that cells are going to take up amino acids. And we know that amino acids are the building block of proteins, which proteins are used for so many different functions throughout the human body. This is especially relevant for muscle growth. Okay, both bone and muscle, but especially relevant for muscle growth. Growth hormone also helps stimulate the metabolism of fat, that is, breaking down fats in our body. If you have fat stored in adipose tissues, so fat cells within your body, then growth hormone will basically mobilize those fats, bringing them into the bloodstream. This makes them available for cellular breakdown. Because of this lipid mobilization that I just mentioned here, this lipid mobilization, an increase in lipid breakdown occurs within cells. Growth hormone gradually shifts the body away from a normal glucose catabolism, which is essentially using glucose as an energy source, to instead a lipid catabolism, so using lipids as an energy source. Since glucose is not being broken down in this situation, we will see an increase in blood glucose levels. So if glucose isn't being broken down, then we see an increase in blood glucose levels. So when that happens, growth hormone is going to act as an antagonist to another hormone called insulin. And insulin, as we'll talk about later, but you should already know, is a hormone that is released when blood glucose levels rise. And in order for glucose to be taken into the cells in the body, we need insulin. So insulin tries to reduce blood glucose levels, whereas growth hormone works to actually increase glucose levels. So we can say that growth hormone functions as an insulin antagonist. So they work against each other. I had mentioned that we were first going to cover growth hormone. Now we're going to get into prolactin. Remember, if you saw on a slide previous, prolactin is oftentimes referred to as lactogenic hormone. I'm not sure if it was mentioned on the other slide, but it is written here. So prolactin, also known as lactogenic hormone. Anytime you see lact, you're oftentimes thinking of milk production. And prolactin primarily plays a very important role in milk production in both pregnant and breastfeeding women. During the course of a woman's pregnancy, prolactin levels will begin to increase. And this is going to contribute to the increase in breast size and an increase in milk ducts within the breasts. Prolactin will also start the process of triggering milk production shortly after birth as well. So as I already mentioned, it's present during pregnancy, it starts to increase, but then after birth, it triggers milk production as well. We'll come back to prolactin later on, discussing its relationships to a hormone called oxytocin. And oxytocin, again, we'll address this later, contributes to milk release rather than milk production. So I've just returned to this diagram from a few slides ago to show you that we've covered prolactin and we've covered growth hormone. Now we're going to look at adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and then luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Now, why I've really bolded this area off here is so that you're aware that these hormones are considered tropic hormones. And we discussed in our lecture on endocrine regulation that tropic hormones have an effect on further endocrine glands. So you have glands that release tropic hormones, and tropic hormones are going to affect on another gland. So in this case, these hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland, these three here, these hormones here, can then stimulate other endocrine glands rather than just having an effect on the end tissue. With tropic hormones, the primary responsibility is to stimulate other endocrine glands, okay? Again, rather than an end tissue. So for this slide, each of the actual tropic hormones are listed in red. And the actual endocrine gland that they're going to stimulate is bolded in black. So I'll repeat that. On this slide, each of the actual tropic hormones are listed in red, and the actual endocrine gland that they stimulate is bolded in black. Okay, these in red are what the adenohypophysis are going to secrete. The first hormone that we'll talk about is thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin, or TSH. And as the name suggests, being thyroid stimulating hormone, it promotes the growth and development of the thyroid gland, and we'll cover the thyroid gland in more detail later. Thyroid stimulating hormone also triggers the thyroid gland to secrete its hormones, so stimulating the thyroid gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone promotes the growth and development of the adrenal gland. So whenever you're reading names of hormones, oftentimes it gives us an idea of what it's going to do. So it stimulates the growth, promotes growth and development of the adrenal gland, mainly though the cortex, and as we'll see later, this is the outer region. ACTH will also then trigger the cortex of the adrenal gland to then secrete some of its hormones. That's its tropic function, right? The next type of tropic hormones are gonadotropic hormones. And the examples that we have here are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. When you hear the term gonad, you should know that it's referring to the ovaries or the testes. Let's begin with follicle-stimulating hormone. This has a slightly different effect in males than females. In females, so when acting on the ovaries, it stimulates the growth of the follicles, as the name suggests, and then the follicles are going to start secreting estrogen. So what it's essentially doing is stimulating further production of estrogen within the ovaries. In males, however, it's going to stimulate the production of sperm through a process called spermatogenesis. So genesis being forming of, and sperm. So the forming of sperm. And FSH will also stimulate the secretion of a hormone called inhibin, which is involved in a negative feedback mechanism within the testes. And this will be elaborated on later on in the course when we get into the reproductive system. The last gonadotropin hormone, which is a tropic hormone of the anterior pituitary, is luteinizing hormone, which in females stimulates the formation of the corpus luteum, and this will then produce and secrete progesterone and estrogen from the ovary. This has to do with the female cycle, which we'll get into again in the reproductive system. But in males, it stimulates interstitial cells that are found within the testes to both develop and secrete testosterone. And as you'll learn later, it's these interstitial cells within the testes that secrete testosterone because they're being stimulated by luteinizing hormone. It's important to know that the hormones we just spoke about are under the control of yet further hormones that are released from a very important gland called the hypothalamus. So I'll show you that here. Here's the hypothalamus. Okay, so everything that we have just spoken about is really under the control of the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, as I briefly mentioned earlier, is a key integrator of our autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. So integrating information amongst the two. And neurons that are found within the hypothalamus actually produce hormones. So I'm going to show you these neurons here. So these neurons within the hypothalamus are actually going to produce hormones. Within the hypothalamus, within these neurons, we have specialized cells that are called neurosecretory cells, which you can see here, neurosecretory cells. And there are different types of neurosecretory cells that will produce different releasing hormones, because as we've always talked about, specific cells are designed to produce specific hormones. But these cells can all be found within the same area, but they're specialized. So these cells are going to be producing hormones that are really referred to as quote unquote releasing hormones. Okay, so oftentimes you're going to hear hormones that are produced within the hypothalamus as releasing hormones. And you could argue that these releasing hormones are actually a type of tropic hormone, right? Because it's one gland stimulating another gland. And hormones that are produced here are going to be released into the bloodstream through what's called a hypophyseal portal system and travel to the pituitary. So I'll show you that here. First of all, I want you to remember that we're still talking about the adenohypophysis. Okay? And that's important to know because the process I'm teaching you right now is only really relevant for this gland. So the hormones that are produced here are going to enter into what I referred to as a hypophyseal. Remember, hypophyseal is oftentimes referred to as pituitary. Hypophyseal portal system. So it's a circulatory system that allows for the travel of hormones to reach the pituitary gland. So it's the releasing hormones from here that are going to be sent to the pituitary gland. Once these releasing hormones arrive at the pituitary gland, they're going to look for their target cells. So the cells that they're designed to actually stimulate. This will cause those cells, once they reach them in this area here, will cause these cells to release their hormones, which then travel out through an anterior hypophyseal vein, which you can see right here, and into our general circulation to then do what it's supposed to do at that point. The hypothalamus, going back up here, will produce specific releasing hormones that are meant for specific cells of the pituitary gland. So again, think back to our lecture on endocrine gland regulation, that specific hormones produced by specific cells, in this case within the hypothalamus, are going to look for their target cell within the anterior pituitary. And only when it finds their target cell can it bind to it like a lock and key. Now let's look at some examples. At the top you can see a variety of different releasing hormones. Okay, you can see them all at the top within the hypothalamus because that's where they're produced and where they're secreted. Specific cells within the hypothalamus are producing these releasing hormones. So specific cells are going to produce gonadotropin releasing hormone, etc. All specific cells for these different releasing hormones. And if you'd like to look at these, of course, are abbreviations, but if you'd like to look in further detail, it's all within your textbook. So these hormones, once they're produced, they're going to be secreted into the hypophyseal portal system, which you can see here. So that's that blood system that will bring those releasing hormones toward the anterior pituitary gland, for which, of course, they will look for their specific target cell. The target cell within the anterior pituitary is going to be stimulated by these releasing hormones, and then they are going to produce and release their own specific hormones, right? So now we have our own specific hormones that are produced specifically within the anterior pituitary gland. Then they're going to enter the general blood circulation and do what it is they're going to do. So depending on the hormone, it's either going to stimulate another gland, as you can see here, or it's going to go right to its end tissue. And of course, if it's stimulating another gland, like this one, and this one, we know that they are considered tropic hormones, right? One gland secreting a hormone to stimulate another gland. You can also see at the top here that you'll see green and red and a minus sign and a plus sign. This is just telling us that if it's green with a plus, it's going to have an enhancing effect. This releasing has an enhancing effect on the further cells that it's stimulating. Or you can see that in the case here, we have a hormone that's going to be, it's called somatostatin, SS, that when it's released is going to have an inhibitory effect on these cells within the anterior pituitary that it stimulates. Okay? So how does the body know then that enough of a hormone has been produced? When does it stop? Does it keep going? Does it stop on its own? But the answer is in negative feedbacks or in feedback control, specifically negative over positive. And most hormones which you should be aware of, that most hormones are under the influence of a negative feedback loop. So if we look here at the thyroid gland, we will learn about this a little bit more in detail later, but the thyroid gland releases two main hormones called T3 and T4. And when T3 and T4 are produced, we're going to end up having a shorter and a longer feedback loop back up toward the brain. And that's going to give input to the brain. So in case of the long feedback loop going right up to the central nervous system, it's going to give impact on the brain to stop the production of this releasing hormone. And then this short feedback loop is going to go back up into the pituitary gland to prevent further production of thyroid stimulating hormones, so that the thyroid is no longer stimulated to produce T3 and T4. In addition to that, thyroid stimulating hormone itself, when it's released, is going to create a short feedback loop back, again telling the pituitary gland, specifically the adenohypophysis, to stop producing thyroid stimulating hormone. And this helps keep everything fine-tuned and in control. Otherwise, things would certainly go awry. This here is a graph showing you the secretion of specifically growth hormone. In this example, the amount of growth hormone in blood plasma, which you can see written here, was plotted on a graph every 5 minutes over the course of 24 hours in a particular individual. And you should note that growth hormone fluctuates quite chaotically minute by minute. Occasionally it has major peaks. You can see that the peaks get larger after you fall asleep. So through the night, your levels of growth hormone are much higher than they are during the day. And the surges of growth hormone result partly from pulses of what's called growth hormone releasing hormone. So just as the name would suggest, throughout the night we get these pulses of growth hormone releasing hormone, which then stimulates the release of growth hormone itself. And this growth hormone releasing hormone comes from the hypothalamus, because we know that releasing hormones are originating in the hypothalamus. And of course then this stimulates the anterior pituitary, which secretes growth hormone. So the purpose of this slide is really meant to show you that it's not a nice smooth line for hormone presence in the blood, right? You're getting lots and lots of ups and downs quite chaotically throughout the day, depending on many different factors, stressful situations, what our body needs to do at the time, if we've just eaten, if we haven't eaten. There's so many different factors that can impact it. So we've pretty much covered what you need to know for the anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis. But now we're going on to the posterior pituitary gland. So we've covered this area, and now we're going on to the posterior pituitary gland, also known as the neurohypophysis. And if it helps you remember it, well, A for adenohypophysis is A for anterior pituitary, but you'll see why neuro is very relevant when it comes to the posterior pituitary gland compared to the anterior. The key difference between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary is that the posterior pituitary does not directly produce its own hormones. That's key. So I'll say that again. The posterior pituitary gland does not directly produce its own hormones. There are therefore no cells that are discrete to the posterior pituitary that are actually producing hormones. Now let's look here at I'll remind you of the neurosecretory cells that we know are found within the hypothalamus. These, in the case of the posterior pituitary gland, they project all the way down into the posterior pituitary. So from the hypothalamus down that infundibulum into the posterior pituitary gland. And I guess I'll reword that to say that the neurosecretory cells here have their cell body located within the hypothalamus right here, but their axons project all the way down to their axon terminal into the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis. Therefore, hormones that are synthesized up here in the hypothalamus are actually released directly into the neurohypophysis, where they are then stored here and released here. So this really differentiates the posterior pituitary from the anterior pituitary, who receives hormones from the hypothalamus through that hypophyseal portal system, or through the blood. Okay, so more of a blood travel of hormones versus a more of a neuron transfer of hormones. And again, that's the neuro component of hypophysis. And again, hypophysis refers to pituitary gland. All right, so we know that there are 5 main hormones released from the anterior pituitary, and we covered those already. But there are 2 main hormones released by the posterior pituitary gland. But of course, we know that they're not produced within the posterior pituitary, but that they're produced within the hypothalamus. And these 2 hormones are ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone, oftentimes sometimes referred to as vasopressin because it impacts blood pressure, but we'll talk about that later, and oxytocin. And you should know what cells make each. So it's the supraoptic nucleus, which you can see here, that makes antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and it's the paraventricular nucleus that's going to produce OT, also known as oxytocin. And so ADH and oxytocin are stored here, produced here in the hypothalamus, but stored here in the pituitary gland and released from here as well. Now, what is it that these hormones do? So ADH as well as oxytocin. Well, starting with antidiuretic hormone, as the name would suggest, is basically against, because of anti-diuresis. And diuresis involves the production of a lot of dilute, or production of large volumes of urine. Therefore, ADH, as the name anti would suggest, is countering this mechanism. For example, if you were very dehydrated and you would not be producing a lot of urine, because that would further dehydrate you, right? So if you're dehydrated, you don't want to produce too much urine because it would cause further dehydration. So if you are dehydrated, then your body's going to release ADH, antidiuretic hormone, to which will help your body reabsorb water in the kidney to help your body conserve water, to prevent, something close to death. This hormone, ADH, is oftentimes also referred to as vasopressin, and the reason for that is because it has an effect on blood pressure, and so the release of ADH or vasopressin is therefore sometimes triggered by a drop in blood pressure, because as we'll speak about shortly, the amount of water in your body can impact your blood volume and blood pressure. So oxytocin, or OT, we've spoken about prolactin already and its role in the production of milk, but oxytocin is the hormone that actually triggers the release of milk from the breast. So it's not involved in the production of milk, but instead with the release of milk. So when an infant begins to breastfeed, this action actually causes the release, its stimulation of the nipple causes the release of oxytocin, which works quite quickly then to release milk from the breast so that the baby can eat. Oxytocin has other effects as well. It's also involved in sexual arousal and social bonding. It's commonly referred to as the love hormone because when groups of people are together in the presence of this hormone, it can actually increase bonding. There is still research being done on oxytocin and the role that it actually plays in people with autism. So there's not much we'll talk about that, but just the current research is quite interesting, so it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And then lastly, oxytocin is involved in childbirth as it causes contraction of the muscles of the uterus in order to induce childbirth. And there's synthetic versions of oxytocin called Pitocin that are sometimes given to women externally, so not something you're naturally producing within your body. If say a woman is not producing enough oxytocin, she can be given Pitocin, which is a synthetic version of oxytocin, to help progress her childbirth. Okay, let's move on now to the pineal gland. So we just finished up talking about the posterior pituitary gland, which was only 2 hormones compared to the 5 with the anterior pituitary gland. So now we'll go on to talking about the pineal gland. The pineal gland is located centrally within the brain, and it gets its name because it has a somewhat pine cone shape to it. The pineal gland is considered to be part of the nervous system because it contains neurons that are responsive to visual stimuli that are directly connected to the retina. But it's also part of the endocrine system because it secretes hormones. So I'll say that again because it's important. The pineal gland is considered part of the nervous system because, one, it contains neurons that are responsive to visual stimuli that are directly connected to the retina. So visual stimuli coming in through your eye and stimulating the retina. But it is also an endocrine gland, and this is because it secretes hormones. And the primary hormone that is secreted, which I'm sure you've heard of, is called melatonin, which is a key part of the body's biological clock. And it's this hormone that fluctuates daily throughout the day. And in the leading time up towards you going to bed, as it starts to get darker, your melatonin levels are going to naturally begin to increase and stay high through the night, which helps us sleep. And it's critical for both inducing sleep and helping you sleep as well. So that was all for the pineal gland. Now we'll move on to the thyroid gland, which we brought up a few times already. The thyroid gland is located on the surface of the trachea. So we have the trachea here. Here's the thyroid gland, just in the region of your neck. And it's also located just below the larynx, which is here, our voice box. And as you can see, it's somewhat of a butterfly shape. It has two lobes, 1 and 2, with a central connection called the isthmus. And you can also see a small central lobe that projects upwards, and we call this the pyramidal lobe. And in total, it only weighs about 30 grams. You can see the anatomical structures on this cadaver here as well. You can't see it quite as clear as you can, of course, when it's done in a print like this, in an image like this. But you can see that the thyroid gland is this region here. This here is your voice box. Here's the isthmus, which connects both lobes of the thyroid gland. Okay. Now, if we did a cross-section through the thyroid gland, you would see very characteristic structures that are very characteristic of the thyroid gland. First of all, you can see small hollow spheres here, all throughout here, and they're surrounded by these purple circles called follicular cells. This is one thyroid. Let's look here, another example. Sorry, let's look here, and this would be the lumen of the thyroid. And you can see blood vessels in different areas as well, or capillaries. And these are located in, as you can see, fairly close proximity to those follicular cells, and there's a good reason for that, aside from the fact that it's where hormones can be secreted and then enter into the area. And the different types of thyroid hormones that we're going to be speaking about are T3 and T4. Those are its short names, of course, and we will look at the long name and break it down so that it doesn't seem so confusing. If we're to pronounce it, the first one is triiodothyronine, and the second one is tetraiodothyronine. Now let's break down the name. First of all, both are thyronines, which you can see here. And thyronines are just amino acids. Now these amino acids, these thyronines, are either going to have 3 or 4 iodine molecules attached to it. So if there's 3 iodine molecules, then it's triiodo, referring to iodine, and thyronine, referring to the amino acids. So we have thyronines that have 3 or 4 amino acids attached to them. And then, of course, in this case, there's 4, being tetra. These two hormones are released together. So T3 and T4 are released together when the thyroid is stimulated. But T4 is the most abundant hormone that's released into the bloodstream. And T4 actually gets converted into T3 because one of the iodine molecules ends up being broken off. And you should know that T3 is actually considered our main thyroid hormone that has actions on further cells, and T3 is also the most potent of our thyroid hormones. So now we're going to go into further detail on how it is that the thyroid hormones are synthesized. I'll be speaking for a little while on this slide, so this is definitely a good one to pay attention to. First of all, we know that iodine, we talked about this briefly in class, is a critical component to the thyroid hormones. And without a dietary source of this iodine, it's impossible to make these hormones, being T3 and T4. Nowadays, most salts has iodine added to it to avoid any potential deficiencies, so we don't see these iodine deficiencies as much anymore. So any iodine that's within our blood, up here, gets taken up into the thyroid gland. At the bottom of the screen, you can see the actual lumen of the thyroid follicle. And this area here is the follicular, we have the follicular cells and the blood vessels. So iodine, as well as various different amino acids, are going to be taken up into the follicular cells. The iodine and the amino acids can be taken into the follicle, where they end up forming something called thyroglobulin, which you can see here. And thyroglobulin is a chain of amino acids that has both tyrosine and iodine added to it. And this is from your textbook, and there's a summary on the side here. Okay, so once again, thyroglobulin is a chain of amino acids that has both tyrosine and iodine added to it. Now, looking closely, you can see that there's these small purple units here. It's difficult to show with my mouse, but you'll be able to see it on your screen. These small purple units that are iodine that are attaching themselves to to these yellow amino acids, which we call tyrosine. Okay, so iodine attaching itself to tyrosine, which are amino acids. And this forms kind of a little side chain to the main thyroglobulin molecule. This is considered the precursor to thyroid hormones, and it's stored here until it's needed. Now, when thyroid hormones are needed to be produced, this thyroglobulin is going to be taken back up into the cells, so up in through here through a process that should be somewhat familiar to you called endocytosis. And it's in this area here that it's going to be broken down. Any of the amino acids that are forming the main chain can be recycled and reused. We oftentimes recycle and reuse amino acids throughout our body because they're so vital, and of course the building block to proteins. So the amino acids are going to be recycled and reused as they're broken down, and we're going to be left with tyrosine. And these tyrosines are going to be attached to either 3 or 4 iodine molecules. T3 if it's 3, and T4 if it's 4 iodine molecules. You should know that T3 and T4 are actually lipophilic, which means that they like fat or lipids, but they don't like water, which means that they're going to have a transporter protein attached to them in order to get to their specific target cells around the body. Once these hormones are secreted out of the thyroid follicular cells and into the bloodstream, this is where they'll bind to that plasma protein that acts as a carrier. And of course, we know that plasma is made up of so much water, so because these these hormones like fat and not water, they need a carrier protein, and we call that a plasma protein. And what are they called specifically? They're called thyroid binding globulins, or TBG, which you can see up here for short. After T3 and T4 bind to these thyroid binding globulins, or TBGs, they're going to then circulate throughout the blood or throughout the body until they reach their target cell. At which point, and we spoke about this briefly in our first lecture, that when a hormone that's being carried reaches its target cell, it's going to then dissociate from its carrier, in this case TBG, and be taken up into the cell. So what do these thyroid hormones actually do? We learned just briefly how they're produced, but what do they actually do? Well, thyroid hormones have a very diverse effect on many different cells in the body. In general, we can say that they help regulate metabolic rate of all cells. increasing metabolic rate of cells, increasing cell growth, and cell differentiation. Thyroid hormones pretty much act on all cells, and so thyroid hormones don't really have specific target tissue, which I've indicated here that they have more of a general target because they act on almost all cells within the body. And that's different than many other hormones throughout our body that do have a specific target. Thyroid hormones have a general target. Now, when we were looking a couple slides back, I'm just going to go back for a minute, you may have noticed, if you're very observant, these smaller cells that are located in a few areas throughout the thyroid gland. And these smaller cells, which we can also see on this screen here, where are they? Right here. These are located sort of adjacent to or just outside of the follicles of the thyroid, and they're called parafollicular cells. Para meaning sitting beside or next to. Make sure that you don't confuse the word parafollicular with parathyroid because they mean very different things, so make sure you don't confuse yourself. And it took a lot of research to learn that these cells actually secrete yet another hormone, and this hormone is called calcitonin, or CT for short. Calcitonin is produced by the thyroid gland, of course, but by the time calcitonin was discovered, the thyroid gland was pretty much just associated with its hormones T3 and T4. So the name calcitonin actually reflects its purpose, which is to maintain calcium homeostasis. In other words, keeping calcium in balance throughout the body. If calcium levels are high in our blood, it could be if we've had a lot of dairy that had a lot of food that was fortified with calcium, our blood calcium levels are going to go up. Calcitonin is going to work to decrease this calcium blood concentration by promoting the removal of calcium from our blood and then depositing it into bone. There's other areas that it's absorbed into as well, but for this purpose, I'd like you to just know that calcium from the blood, because of calcitonin, is pulled out of the blood and it's deposited into bone, which promotes the conservation of that hard bone matrix. Now there is one more hormone on this slide that we'll talk about, and it is an antagonist to calcitonin, meaning it works in opposition to calcitonin, and it's referred to as parathyroid hormone, or PTH. This hormone actually causes the opposite effect of calcitonin. So if calcium levels are low in the blood, let's say we haven't eaten in a while, parathyroid hormone is going to work to pull calcium from the bones and other areas as well and put it in the blood, keeping our blood calcium concentration at the appropriate balance. And this is another example of negative feedback. So on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, you can see these distinct regions here called the parathyroid glands, and there's 4 of them. And it's the parathyroid glands specifically that produce the parathyroid hormone. Okay, so we know that calcitonin is produced here and parathyroid hormone is produced here, but specifically parathyroid hormone is produced by the parathyroid glands. And this diagram just demonstrates the negative feedback mechanism that I already discussed, which is that if your blood calcium levels are low, you're going to have parathyroid hormone secretion increases from the parathyroid glands, which is going to break down bony matrix to pull out calcium and put calcium in the blood, which normalizes our calcium levels in our blood. In opposite to that, if we have high blood calcium levels, instead we're going to have calcitonin secretion from the thyroid gland. This is going to break down bony matrix with osteoclasts that break down the bone, causing calcium levels to increase in the blood, or calcium deposited into the blood, which again normalizes calcium levels. All right. Let's move on now to the adrenal glands, which is also a main endocrine gland. These glands are located on top of the kidneys. You can think of or in addition on top of renal being the kidneys. These glands sit on top of the kidneys and they're a pyramid shape, as you can tell. Now when we cut through the adrenal gland, so we'll cut through a cross section here, we can see, looking still at this diagram here, we can see 3 distinct layers. The outermost layer is the capsule, This is a protective connective tissue. The next layer is the cortex, which actually produces hormones. And then we have the inner layer, the medulla, which we'll talk about later. Now, if we take a cross-section of mainly just the cortex here, we can see 3 additional layers. The zona glomerulosa, which is here. You can see actually the capsule here. The zona glomerulosa is here. Right through here, a much larger area called the zona fasciculata. And then down here at the bottom, the innermost region of the cortex is the zona reticularis. And these different regions are actually responsible for secreting different hormones. You can also see at the bottom here, the medulla. You can see on this diagram below then, just a very simple diagram, what hormones are released from what specific tissue of that or layer of that adrenal cortex. The zona glomerulosa releases mineralocorticoids. The zona fasciculata releases glucocorticoids, and the zona reticularis releases gonadocorticoids. And then, of course, you can see that innermost layer, the medulla, but we're not really going to be talking about catecholamines. Now, let's elaborate now on the hormone released from the zona glomerulosa. So this layer right here. And this is a mineralocorticoid. And the primary hormone or type of hormone that is a mineralocorticoid is called aldosterone. And the primary role of aldosterone is maintaining levels of sodium, so specifically sodium within our body. In other words, it's trying to maintain sodium homeostasis. Now, when aldosterone is produced, it triggers an increase in sodium reabsorption from the kidney tubules. Okay, we're trying to maintain levels of sodium. Whenever sodium ions are reabsorbed in the body, this automatically causes water retention. The reason for that is because water will follow the sodium just by the process of osmosis. In addition to this, through this process, so we're reabsorbing sodium and in turn water, we also end up having a loss of potassium ions and a loss of hydrogen ions. And the reason for the loss of these 2 ions is because when you're already dehydrated, like in a situation like what we're referring to now, these ions can actually become toxic to you. So let's talk about this aldosterone complex cascade control system here and elaborate on it a little bit. So we'll be on this slide for a couple more minutes. Aldosterone is, as I just said, under quite a complex cascade control system, and it's called the RAAS system, which stands for the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. It's briefly summarized in the diagram that you can see up here. Now let's look at a situation in which you have a decrease in sodium ion concentration. When you have a decrease in sodium ion concentration, this is going to trigger the production of renin from the kidneys. Okay, renin from the kidneys. See renin here. Okay, once again, when there's a decrease in sodium ion concentration, this will trigger the production of renin from the kidney. And renin is the first hormone in this cascade system. In turn, renin will then act on an inactive hormone called angiotensinogen, which you can see right here. So renin acts on angiotensinogen, which is considered an inactive hormone. And angiotensinogen, you can make a note of it, is constantly being produced by the liver. So when renin is secreted, it's going to act on angiotensinogen, which will then convert it into its active form, which is called angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 is going to get converted into angiotensin 2 once it comes into contact with ACE, which stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin 2 within the lungs will then circulate to the adrenal cortex, so part of the the outer part, where it's going to cause the release of aldosterone. And aldosterone is released from the adrenal cortex, which we've already spoken about. Aldosterone then, once it's released, is going to enter into our circulation, and it's going to act on the kidney to increase sodium reabsorption. Because remember, we started off with decreases in sodium concentration, and the whole purpose of this cascade is to now increase sodium reabsorption. And it's this cascade system that maintains sodium levels in the blood. And of course, remember what I had mentioned, that when we're reabsorbing sodium, we're also pulling water because water follows sodium. And this allows for sodium homeostasis. There's also this diagram is from the textbook, so I would suggest reviewing that because we spoke quite a bit about it. All right, next up from the zona fasciculata, we have the glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol, cortisone, and corticosterone. And they're all structurally related, but the primary glucocorticoid in terms of abundance, activity, and potency is actually cortisol, which is bolded. Cortisol, I have mentioned this in class, but you've probably heard this. It's referred to as the stress hormone. We'll come back to this at some point. What you need to know about glucocorticoids is that they are mobilizing proteins, and they're used as an energy source. And so when we are using it as an energy source, we can actually say that they're considered gluconeogenic. And I'll break down that word for you. Gluconeogenic means producing new sources, neogenic, formation of glucose. So producing new sources of glucose. And these new sources of glucose in this case are primarily from proteins. But they are also from lipids. And this is done through lipid catabolism. So the breaking down of lipids to form new glucose. Okay, from protein and also from lipid, I should say. I'm sorry, I may have circled this area, but from lipid catabolism. Okay, carbohydrates, we're referring to glucose. Now, there are many different functions of glucocorticoids, but a big one, in conjunction with a hormone called epinephrine that we'll talk about later, is maintaining normal levels of blood pressure. Okay? Essential for maintaining normal blood pressure. Now, with cortisol being a stress hormone, both from it, we're going to see an impact of this hormone both from different types of stressors, mental, sure, but physical stress, definitely. And when our body goes through this physical stress, we get a substantial increase in cortisol into our blood. Similar to growth hormone, we get these peaks in cortisol secretion throughout the day. And you can see here that we get a surge of cortisol right around here when we first wake up, and then continues on within the first few hours of waking. Also, similar to growth hormone, glucocorticoids virtually act on all cells. And you could think of them as sort of having complementary features between the two. Okay, so glucocorticoids essentially act on all cells. Now, the interior of the adrenal gland is the adrenal medulla. So we spoke about a little bit about the different layers within the cortex. Now we're looking at the interior, which is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is composed of neurosecretory tissue. So we're coming back to that term, neurosecretory. And this is a tissue that's composed of neurons, right? Neuro, composed of neurons. And these neurons are going to secrete products into the blood rather than across a synapse. And I spoke about that in class, how neurosecretory tissue is a little bit different because the hormones that are produced here, or the products produced here, are going to be sent into the bloodstream, even though they consist of neurons, rather than a nerve impulse or chemicals being sent across a synapse. The adrenal medulla, or the cells of the adrenal medulla, are called medullary cells, just as comes from the name adrenal medulla. And it's these medullary cells that are going to secrete hormones during a sympathetic nervous system response. And if you forget what the nervous system is, it's a part of the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system, which also includes the parasympathetic nervous system. But the sympathetic nervous system in particular activates what is often termed the fight or flight response. And the hormones that are produced within the medullary cells of the adrenal medulla are going to be subsequently secreted directly into the blood. And the two main important hormones are also considered non-steroid hormones, are epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, and the majority of the secretion is from epinephrine. And we also have the secretion of norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline. So these are secreted into the blood under certain circumstances. These hormones will then bind to receptors that are found on specifically a specific type of effector called a sympathetic effector. And oftentimes we'll see the sympathetic effector as being the heart, as well as smooth muscle tissue throughout the body. And its purpose is to prolong and enhance the effects of the sympathetic stimulation by the autonomic nervous system. So I know that's a little bit confusing and a lot of big words there, but make sure you refer to your textbook for elaboration. Okay? Now onto the pancreas. The pancreas, as you can tell from this diagram, it's a long, elongated gland. It weighs up to about 100 grams. And if we look closer at the tissues of the pancreas, you can see that it's composed of both endocrine and exocrine tissue. Okay, so you can see the word exocrine here, and then the remaining are endocrine. And I want you to remember that exocrine glands, which is not the focus of this lecture, are ductless glands that secrete their products directly and locally in the area, versus endocrine glands, which, I need to go back for a moment. Exocrine glands have ducts. I said ductless, but I meant they have ducts that secrete their products directly into the area. Whereas endocrine glands, we know, are ductless and secrete their products usually into the bloodstream. The endocrine portion is made up of tiny scattered islands of cells that we call pancreatic islets. And the pancreatic islets are also referred to, I'm sure you've heard of this before, but islets of Langerhans. And they only account for a small percentage of the total mass of the pancreas, but their role is huge. And we'll talk about the four cells on the next slide, but we have the delta cells, the alpha cells, the epsilon cells, the beta cells, and then the pancreatic polypeptide cells, also known as PP. And just so you're aware, the Purkinje cells are actually exocrine cells, because we know that the pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions. And the Purkinje is not going to be a focus, but they secrete, so that you're aware, they secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine to assist with digestion. Okay, we've only got a few slides left. So here are a list of the 5 primary types of endocrine cells that are joined together by gap junctions. That's important for you to know. They're joined by gap junctions, which means even though they all sort of work independently, there is the possibility of them actually working together. Let's start with alpha cells. These produce and secrete glucagon. And glucagon is a hormone that tends to increase blood glucose levels. And it does this by stimulating the conversion of glycogen into glucose, so that we can add glucose to the blood and increase glucose levels. And this process of converting glycogen to glucose is done in liver cells, because we tend to store glucose in liver cells. Glucagon also stimulates the formation of new glucose, through the process of gluconeogenesis, so formation of new glucose. So if you've not eaten in a while, your blood glucose levels decrease, and in response, glucagon will be released to help increase those glucose levels and help maintain homeostasis. Next up is the beta cells. Beta cells produce and secrete insulin, which actually has the opposite effect, or you could say antagonistic effect to glucagon. Insulin tends to lower blood glucose levels by promoting the movement of glucose, as well as amino acids and fatty acids, but we're focusing mainly on the movement of glucose out of the blood to lower blood glucose levels, where it's brought into the tissues. And as you should know, when glucose is brought into tissues, it's going to be then used to produce energy. Okay, so next up are the delta cells, and the delta cells produce and secrete a hormone called somatostatin. And somatostatin's primary role is to regulate other pancreatic endocrine cells. So it's basically a regulatory hormone. And somatostatin, and I mentioned this in a slide earlier, it inhibits the secretion of some other hormones. In particular, it inhibits the secretion of growth hormone, glucagon, insulin, and also pancreatic polypeptide, which is that PP. Okay, so somatostatin inhibits the secretion of growth hormone, glucagon, insulin, and pancreatic polypeptide. So next up is pancreatic polypeptide, which cells produce and secrete pancreatic polypeptide. Easy enough. So you should remember that it's this hormone that can be inhibited by the presence of somatostatin. So much is still needed to be learned about these cells, but we do know that they influence digestion. And we know this because it regulates digestive secretions from our pancreas as well as our gastrointestinal tract. And of course, those secretions are digestive enzymes that are released to promote digestion. And very lastly, epsilon cells secrete ghrelin, which will actually stimulate the hypothalamus to boost your appetite. Okay, so ghrelin is a hormone secreted by epsilon cells that stimulate the hypothalamus to boost your appetite. Ghrelin also has a role in slowing your metabolism, and because of these reasons may actually play a role in obesity, but there's still a lot to be studied on that. The next slide here, we're going to I'm just showing you the feedback mechanism when it comes to glucose or when it comes to insulin and glucagon. That's the area that I've circled here. The alpha and beta cells are very important and heavily researched. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail because I've already spoken to you about it, but it's just showing you what happens when glucose levels are high in the blood and how the body returns it to normal glucose level, and then what happens when blood glucose levels are low in the blood to return it again to normal or equilibrium homeostasis. So this would be a situation where high blood glucose levels is after you've just eaten. This is what will happen. And low blood glucose levels if you haven't eaten in a while. So first thing in the morning is usually a good example. So you should be aware of what actually increases and what actually decreases in both situations. All right, gastric and intestinal mucosa. So the mucus lining of our gastrointestinal tract, which is what I'm about to say is similar to the pancreas, it contains cells that produce both endocrine and exocrine secretions, and that's not common amongst all glands in the body, but you should know that it's the gastrointestinal tract as well as the pancreas that have both endocrine and exocrine glands and corresponding hormones and secretions. So gastrointestinal hormones such as gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin, or CCK, have very important regulatory roles in coordinating both the secretory, and motor activities that are involved in digestion. Okay, so it has regulatory roles in coordinating the secretory and motor activities that are involved in the digestive process. Now, we've already spoken about ghrelin and its role in boosting appetite through stimulation of the hypothalamus, and how it also slows metabolism. But this hormone is also secreted by the gastric mucosa as well. So it's both the gastric mucosa and the pancreatic islet cells of the pancreas that secrete ghrelin. So it's a hormone that's common amongst the two glands. Okay, the last one we're focusing on is the heart. It's another organ that has a secondary endocrine role. Now, although the heart's main function is to pump blood, there's also a specific area in its wall, specifically the atrial wall, that contains hormone-producing cells. These cells produce several peptide hormones. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in class, but non-steroid hormones are generally peptide hormones, and we spoke about that a little bit last week. So these are the cells within the atrium of the heart produce several peptide hormones, and this group of hormones is collectively called ANH, or atrial natriuretic hormone. And as the name would suggest, it's cells that are of the atrium that produce ANH, and atrial cells will increase their secretion of ANH in response to an increase in stretch of the arterial wall that's caused by abnormal high blood volume or blood pressure. So as blood pressure increases, more blood fills the heart, blood pressure increases, the heart atrial cells stretch, and as soon as that stretch is detected within those cardiac cells, then atrial natriuretic hormone will be released in response to this. And as you can imagine, it's being released in order to help reduce blood pressure or reduce blood volume. The term natriuretic refers to the fact that its principal effect is to promote loss of sodium from the body by means of urine. And as we know that when sodium is then lost from our internal environment, water will then follow, again due to osmosis. Water loss results in then a decrease in blood volume naturally and a decrease in blood pressure. We can therefore state that the primary effect of ANH is to oppose increases in blood volume or blood pressure, or to decrease it, right? To decrease blood volume, decrease blood pressure. We can also state that ANH is an antagonist to a hormone called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, which we spoke about before, and also aldosterone. So one is promoting the loss of sodium in water, and the other is promoting the reabsorption of sodium in water. So you should understand their antagonistic effects. And the last slide, this final slide, is just intended to make you aware that we have only covered some of the major endocrine glands and hormones in this lecture. Some others are far beyond the scope of this course, and then other ones are even beyond the scope of the textbook. But you should know that most tissues in our body produce and secrete hormones, whether it's sex organs, adipose tissue, bony tissue, and the list goes on. This is the end of our lecture on the endocrine glands, which followed the lecture on endocrine regulation. Thank you for listening.